my fellow committee member who will introduce and have a conversation with Catherine Foot. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you, Rob. So Sarah here. We are really honoured to have Catherine with us today. She's got a wonderful wealth of knowledge and is a fabulous speaker. So without further ado, I will hand over to Catherine. Catherine will give us an overview of the work that she's been involved with, and then we will go through a bit of a Q&A session with Catherine. And then if there are any questions from the audience, very happy to, as long as Catherine's happy to take those, that'd be good. So Catherine, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah and Rob, and hello everybody, good evening. Thank you for coming, and thank you for the invitation. So yes, let me tell you a little bit about why I think longevity, longer life expectancies are so important, are going to be so critical to how the UK fares and how we all fare as individuals as we move through the 21st century, and what I'm doing about it through this new think tank, Phoenix Insights, which is a really major investment from the big pensions company, Phoenix Group, in its social purpose, really trying to catalyse much greater national debate and conversation around longevity and why it matters. For me personally, I really would put the question of longer lives and how do we as a society need to reshape our public structures, our policy, our business practice, and our own attitudes right up there with climate change, technological change, as a really fundamental shift that we're seeing in society that if we don't respond effectively, will be an opportunity for some, for those of us with money and good fortune, and a real challenge for those without. So, as I'm sure you're aware, over the last couple of centuries, life expectancy has increased significantly. It's stalling now. The pandemic has put paid to the rate of growth in life expectancy, tragically. And indeed, actually, it looks like there may be some other effects of the widening health inequalities that we see across the UK that are meaning that total life expectancy, average life expectancy, is beginning to stall. And in fact, for the poorest among us, it's starting to reverse. So we're starting to see younger generations of the poorest of us in the UK being predicted to live shorter, sicker lives than previously, which is quite why it's not the national scandal I think it ought to be. I do not know. But that notwithstanding, broadly over the last couple of centuries, life expectancy has dramatically increased, and increased to an extent that we really don't yet internalise as individuals. Most of us, when asked, significantly underestimate our life expectancy, generally thinking about it in terms of our parents, our grandparents, which are simply just not adequate benchmarks for us to think about how long we're going to live. So a baby girl, a baby boy born today in the UK has a really decent chance now of living to 100. The richest baby girls and baby boys are better than 50-50 chance now of living to 100. So the prospect of living to 100, of being a centenarian, will become totally normal and hugely common in society in the decades to come. And I suppose my premise, really, my sort of driving mission, is to encourage more of us to recognise that lives of that sort of length can't really be lived to their greatest potential with the sorts of public policy, social structures and attitudes that we persist with, that frankly sit kind of in the mid-20th century, charitably, maybe even the 19th century for some of the way we think about the course of a life. So if you take, for instance, the idea of a retirement age, current state pension age is 66, it's going to go up to 67, 68, it's legislated for. But actually, if you ask people, when do you expect you're going to retire? We have this incredibly culturally sticky sense of 65. And all of us, generally, on average, aspire to make it or see it as a mark of success to retire a little bit earlier than that. So typically, your almost consistent response of people of all ages, actually. And interesting that there's a surprising age gradient, perhaps, where the younger generations, people now in their 20s and 30s, actually say they want to retire even younger than people currently in their 40s and 50s. But we all typically say kind of early 60s. And if you think about a 100-year life or an 80 or a 90-year life, you're talking, therefore, about retirements that could be 30 years long. How we're going to be able to financially sustain not working for almost as long as we have worked, particularly in an economy with very, very low rates of wage growth over the last decades. The basic maths, essentially, of our lives isn't really adding up anymore. And I think we need to really dramatically rethink a whole series of things to respond to that. Effectively. And of course, I mentioned health inequalities. Of course, these averages tell you a certain story, but what is actually happening for different individuals at different levels on the socioeconomic spectrum is starkly different. So, the healthy life expectancy, the years you could expect to live in good health before the onset of chronic conditions associated with increasing age and disability, in the poorest parts of the UK, is only 50 right now for babies born. It's about 70 for babies born in the richest parts of the country. So a 20-year gap in years spent in poor health between those two groups. So I think, as I said before, I guess for me, these longer lives, could and should be a fantastic opportunity. I mean, what could be a greater gift than literally more time on the planet to do things that matter to us, to spend time with people that we love? It should be an extraordinary opportunity, but one that we simply aren't seizing, and really aren't seizing at all, for the poorest among us. So I suppose one way of thinking about how we need to respond that's important to me would be to recognise that living to 100, living to 80, 90, I think we shouldn't be thinking about it as being old for longer. We should be thinking about what it means for the whole of our lives. And I think reshaping society in response to longevity means taking an approach that thinks about the whole of our lives. There's a nice little playwriting analogy that I like very much for thinking about how I think about longer lives. Imagine just for a moment that you've written a play, a 75-minute play. Hopefully the fairly obvious analogy there being a minute of your play is a sort of year of your life. You've got your 75-minute play, and then along comes the producer, and she says to you, you can have another 15, 20 minutes. What would you do? Would you just let that final scene of your play spin out for another 15, 20 minutes? Or would you take a look at the whole of your plot and think about, where do you want to finish the first act? Where do you want to finish the second act? Where do you want to deepen the plot and have something else happen to your characters? And I think that's how we need to think about our response to longevity. So essentially, we are already seeing shifts in society in when we do our education, for instance. Many more people are staying in education longer, but actually trends in adult education, in taking time to reskill, to retrain, to re-educate ourselves as adults, the trends there are in decline. We're spending less time than we were 10, 20 years ago doing that. And I think that's something moving in entirely the wrong direction. If we're going to sustain potentially 50-year careers in a very fast-moving technological environment with all sorts of other big changes, not least the climate emergency coming our way, the idea that we'll be able to sustain productive, effective, fulfilling working lives from all the education that we've got essentially as children isn't going to stack up anymore. And yet the adult education sector in this country, as I say, is essentially a sector still in decline. So I think we need to do something very different about that. There's an analogy there that I quite like between how we talk about our education and how we talk about our health. When people ask to describe your level of education, not that they do, but if you imagine that they did, generally, you're telling a story of what you did as a child or a very young adult, typically. Maybe the odd professional qualification. I appreciate I'm speaking to an audience of professionals here tonight, but broadly, you speak about what you did as a child. Could be decades ago. Whereas if somebody were to ask you to describe your health right now, your health status as opposed to your education status, you'd never talk about how often you did PE when you were at school. You'd be talking about what you're doing right now. It would be relevant and important to describe how healthy you are in terms of what you've been doing recently about it. And I think we need to think about that for education. I think also we do need to be thinking about when and how long we work. As I say, if we really are going to sustain, we're going to persist within I think a very, very valid and meaningful cultural view that we deserve a period of sort of full-time leisure towards the end of our lives to do different things and not be required to be employed or earn money, then we're going to need to think about how we're going to financially sustain that. And I think that probably does mean fundamentally longer working lives. And of course, to get that right, that means making work for people. And you may have seen articles in recent weeks in the newspapers about this thing, the Great Resignation or the Great Retirement. Literally millions of people over 40 leaving the labour market in their droves in response to the pandemic, rethinking for themselves what matters to them and what's important. Clearly a labour market that is not working for them. I hope for many it's a positive choice and an affordable choice for them. I worry though, with inflation where it is, that we may find that some of those people regret that choice and need to return to the labour market, need to find ways to earn. And actually, we know that age discrimination in society more generally, and certainly in the workplace, is rife. And if you are out of work in your 50s and 60s, it's harder to find a job than it is if you're disabled. It's one of the worst categories to be in as an unemployed person for your re-employment outcomes. And then, of course, I think finally we also need to think about saving. So, Phoenix Insights is set inside, hosted and funded by the pensions company, Phoenix Group. Auto-enrolment has been a fantastic policy success in getting millions of more people saving for their pensions, but it was set at a rate 8%, 5 from your broadly 5 from your employer, 3 from yourself, that isn't actually going to produce an adequate retirement income for many of those people. So even those of us who are auto-enrolled will need to be enabled to more consciously engage with long-term savings and really think about the money that they're putting aside. The state pension, something that actually more than half of us rely on for the majority of our income in retirement. It's not a benefit just for a few people. It's a very, very important part of how most of us will fund our retirement. Is broadly not particularly adequate. The replacement rate of the state of income that the state pension age gives you in this country is much lower than it is in lots of other Western countries. So I think these are all education, employment, money, really fundamental issues that we need to address if we're going to make the most of longer lives. There are others too. I think we're building all the wrong housing stock. For instance, in this country, we're throwing up small, tall homes on the outskirts of towns that will sell, but that don't suit the needs of an aging population, for whom, for so many of us, the choice becomes a family home that proves difficult to get around in, or a care home, something that I think many of us coming out of the pandemic are increasingly unconvinced that are places where we want to spend the end of our lives. And of course, we need to do much more to support more of us to maintain good health. Modern life, as the cliche goes, is killing us. Our sedentary lifestyles, our access to poor quality food. And of course, there are other agendas too, but at Phoenix Insights, we're going to focus particularly on money, work and skills in the first instance, moving into issues of health and housing in due course. So I will be, I hope, producing the sorts of research and analysis that prompts debate, engaging with policymakers and stakeholders, with businesses too, because I don't think government can solve these problems on their own. I think there's a hugely important role for the private sector. And I hope also producing material that reaches the public in some way and begins to build public interest and engagement in some of these issues. And as I say, raise the profile of longevity as a trend we need to be thinking radically and differently about, just as much as we do climate change and technology. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you so much for listening, and really happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Catherine. If I might ask a few questions just first before we go to the audience.
Sure.
You touched on initially that there's a real divergence in society when it comes to living longer lives and longer, better lives. Do you think that that's necessarily linked with poor social inclusion and the poorer population not having access to certain information, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, disadvantage in all its forms accumulates, doesn't it? And either vicious or virtuous cycles form for us. If we start life lucky, we're much more likely to end it lucky, and vice versa. I think information's poverty is the fundamental issue here. I think, Sarah, that when you are struggling to make ends meet, it's very difficult to imagine a future where you can break out of a cycle like that, where you can spend mental bandwidth on things other than the day in front of you and what you need to do. I think we have very poor rates of progression from low pay. So if you begin your career in a low paid job, social mobility, progression through low pay isn't great. It's better in some sectors than others. So I think there are lots of issues here when we look at how we can make this opportunity of longer lives work better for the poorest of us. Some of them are structural, some of them are financial, and absolutely, yeah, I think of course there's a role for information, support, and advice for people of all parts of the spectrum.
Thanks, Catherine. And I've got the next question is almost two in one, so a bit sneaky of me. But what you've touched on the key areas of focus for Phoenix Insights, so the savings, the skills, being better set up with work, and your pension. So what do you think businesses should be doing? And we've got a great group of professionals here, but what should businesses be doing to support employees with these areas? And what's Phoenix Insights? How does Phoenix Insights fit into that equation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think generally age is, if you like, the sort of poor sister to other protected characteristics when companies think about diversity, equality, inclusion, and policies around different groups in their staff base. So I generally see lots more, not saying it's necessarily successful or effective, but lots more will and attention going into issues around ethnic diversity than I do age diversity at the moment, which of course I would argue I think we need to do something about. It's because age is a protected characteristic. It's in the Equality Act. It is illegal to discriminate on the grounds of age, just as it is on the grounds of sexual orientation, race, gender, religion. But actually, ageism, and this isn't just the way employers treat employees. Ageism is just everywhere in our society. It's just totally endemic and socially acceptable, isn't it? Just imagine, I don't know, a phrase like, wow, Sarah, you don't look your age. You look fantastic. What's your secret? I can say that to you. That's okay. That's a compliment. But imagine if you were gay and I said to you, wow, Sarah, you're looking really straight today. Good for you. That's not okay, is it? And yet legally, these things are the same. So I think there's a bigger cultural question there about how we think about age and how ageist we are comfortable being, and how much we, how deeply human it appears to be so terribly ageist. So it's an uphill struggle for employers, I think. But thinking about age bias in recruitment, thinking about managing multi-generational teams, thinking about supporting workers as they, reach middle age and approach retirement, to think about, how could their jobs shift to accommodate other things they're experiencing, the onset of chronic conditions, caring responsibilities for partners or perhaps elderly parents when you reach midlife. I think there's lots we can do to be more age inclusive, that employers should be doing to be more age inclusive. And of course, I think the best employers also, through things like their workplace pension schemes, genuinely try and engage people and give people other sorts of benefits and support about these other things about life, about how to keep healthy, about how to look after your money. And I think, all of those initiatives, if employers are able to sustain and support them for staff, are critical at any age, but they become even more important perhaps as we get older.
Brilliant, thank you. And how does the work of Phoenix Insights fit into the equation there, Catherine?
Well, my aspiration, I've spent my career in charities and think tanks, sort of independent ones, not-for-profit ones, where you sort of sit outside everything, sit outside government, you sit outside business, and you sort of have to knock on the door and say, please, will you care about my social issue? And please, can I, flag wave for something that matters. One of my aspirations about deciding to take a job inside this big pensions company and try doing it from the inside, if you like, is that I'll be able to work with the business. And Phoenix has got 8,000 staff, so it's a pretty decent base of people to do some testing and supporting with, to help encourage the way that Phoenix Group supports its staff and employees, and help them become a kind of leading employer that can then say to the world, say to other leading employers, it's a FTSE 100 company, other FTSE 100 companies listen to each other, and showcase what being a genuinely age inclusive employer can look like. And I sort of hope that maybe by being inside the tent, that'll be easier to do than it has been in the past for me from outside.
Brilliant. That sounds like a good idea to me. Thank you. I've just got one more question before going out to the audience. We've touched on what employers and what businesses could do, but this audience, I know we've got governance professionals, and I know we've also got medical professionals on the call too. What could we as professionals do to help drive forward the change that's needed within our roles, do you think, Catherine?
Well, I'd be really interested to open that conversation up, to be honest, Sarah, to understand who's on the call and not make any assumptions of my own. I'd love to put that question to all of you and hear what you say.
Does anyone want to take that?
Well, I'll make a start if you like. David Locke, I'm a Chartered Secretary. I work in the education sector. There's an awful lot in what you've said, Catherine, and many sort of policy areas of society come together on this. So let me try and, I'll ask a question first, and then try and bring two or three of those together in hopefully a way that will help us. I mean, the question first is, are you in contact with the University of Newcastle and their Centre for Ageing?
Yes, yes, I work very closely with Nicola Palmerini and Tom Sharp up there. They're one of the real centres for excellence,
right.
Centres of excellence in ageing and longevity policy. Newcastle, alongside, I would say, Oxford, Southampton, and Manchester, are the academic centres of excellence, and I work with all of them. Good.
I'm really pleased about that, because having been up to Newcastle and having seen them, that really is joined up thinking.
Yeah.
And it's joined up thinking that is advising government, and I'm pleased you're part of that. Now, my thoughts are these, and I'll pick some issues from what you've said, and then I'll come to something which you've not mentioned. I think we need to completely rethink this notion of we get to a certain age and we retire. Because I know 80-year-olds that are really quite young mentally. They're exciting people, they're doing good things, and so on. And I know people who are in their 30s who are old and tired. And so this notion that you get to an age and then society kind of owes you a bit of relaxation, I think that's a sort of stereotype which needs to be broken. also, I mean, what's hampering a lot of this is the financial situation and the dependence on a pension and the traditional notion that you work with a firm or you work in a way that enables that pension to build up over life until you reach a point, and then you have some options as to whether you take it or you work on. Now, in another place, what we were hearing was, first of all, the relationship between the employee and the employer is now completely different. This idea of a job for life just isn't there. Even a profession for life isn't there. Fourth industrial revolution, the only constant in it is change and the need for re-education and so on. And big questions about whether it's actually wise to give people 3 or 4 years in higher education at the end of school, or whether to give them enough to get started and then tokens, vouchers, whatever, to re-engage as they need to, either while working or not. So that whole business on which society has been built, which has got about retirement and so on, I think needs to be challenging. I think also for the governance professionals in the room, I think we recognise that there's good sense in not doing things for too long, because there comes a time when you run out of ideas. There comes out a time where you need fresh blood in the situation. So it's kind of good to move on. And one of the things I worry about if people don't move on is what effect does that have on younger people? It's harder to get in, more dispiriting and so on. And what will that do for society generally? I think I'll come to the bit that you've not mentioned, and that is some research which has been done has shown that children form their views about society much earlier than we think they do, right? We're thinking about sort of 4 to 7 years old. And lots of research has been done, children in a sort of play situation and what boys will go and do and what girls will go and do. And likewise, sort of different social groups in society. So I think the real challenge we've got is how do we communicate the implications of what you're saying into the primary school curriculum, so children start to come through there with a much more open expectation of how they will spend their life, much more awareness that they're going to have to plan financially to do this. And then the question comes back to us, what should we as employers and professionals do to enable that to happen? Sorry, there's an awful lot in there, but I hope I picked out some useful bits.
Really interesting. Yeah, so much to discuss there. Thank you, David. Yeah, no, I mean, I endorse all of that. I can't quite believe how sticky attitudes to what's expected of us and who does what at what age are in society. My own children very quickly started drawing people they described as grannies and grandpas, with grey hair. And I'd say to them, but your grannies and grandpas don't have grey hair. Where's this idea of grannies and grandpas? Have to have a granny is a woman with sort of grey hair in a bun.
Yeah.
Extraordinary. They'd only ever met female doctors, female GPs, and yet they still managed somehow to pick up this assumption that the doctors were men when they were talking about, imagining a doctor. It's extraordinarily difficult to do, but yeah, really important. I think, yeah, all of the things you say are really interesting. I'm conscious that I'm sure lots of other people, or I hope other people want to contribute too. So let me not respond at length to your points, David, but I think they're very well made. Sarah, are you there?
I'm there. I'm not Sarah.
I'm here. I think there's a question from Dr. T. Baker.
Oh, excellent.
Rob actually was speaking first. Sarah, if you don't mind, Rob was piping up. I'll sit back for a little bit. I don't mind.
Thank you, Dr. T. Baker. I find the whole subject very interesting. I'm neither have hair, and when it does grow, it's white. And I'm not a grandparent as of yet, but I think it's very interesting that society has got a view, and I think education, early education, is very important. I was shocked to know that adult studies have actually declined. Very, very shocked to know that research. So I was wondering if you've done any research on the correlation between studying and working and engagement and actually life expectancy. Do people live longer by staying working longer? Or is there a correlation that when people get to retirement and slowing down, or as David said, taking what's owed to them from society and taking that retirement, is there a correlation with people actually passing away earlier because they don't have a purpose, or necessarily a purpose to get up?
That's the key word, Rob, purpose. Yeah. And many of us find purpose through our work, but others of us find purpose in multiple ways.
Yes.
And reporting that you feel that your life has great meaning and purpose has a direct link to life expectancy. You're more likely to live longer if you feel your life has meaning and purpose. So to the extent that that's defined for you by work, yes, going from sudden full-time work to sudden full-time stop could be, if you like, dangerous. Yeah, absolutely. I think the purpose is the key. It's not sort of work per se. And the other thing about work is that good work is good for you. So meaningful, purposeful work and is good for you, but also work that enables you to maintain your physical health. Work that damages your physical health is, of course, very bad for you. So it depends what you're talking about.
So I suppose it goes back to what David was saying about how do we instill that idea of purpose and repeg it so that from a very early age on, even pre school all the way through to the schooling, how do we get people to view purpose, that it's not just, it's about having value or an impact, or how do we actually get more from life? And and I mean, of course, relationships are really critical here. So, another line of research using these great longitudinal studies that have followed people from childhood through to death over decades and decades all around the world. Meaning and purpose increases your life expectancy is one of their key findings, but so does love. So does having people to love and who love you back. So feeling socially connected with deep, meaningful relationships is also a critical element of meaning and purpose in life for very many of us. So that's also incredibly critical. As is actually, there's also evidence, interestingly, that optimism extends your life expectancy, and lots of debate among psychologists about the degree to which our levels of optimism versus pessimism are nature or nurture, or things that are malleable over the course of our life, or things that aren't. But those of us that are more optimistic live longer. Thank you, Catherine. And I think we'll hand over now to Dr. Tim. Is it Barker or Baker? Your surname's disappeared now.
It's Baker. Sorry, I dropped into the call as I was driving home from work and had a sort of Dr. T Baker for the work tone. Anyway, Tim, strictly Tim. Rob, I quite liked your starting point there. Although I have to be honest, I've been utterly sidetracked by the change of my name. Anyway, so there's a couple of things that from the conversation that I've been listening to on my way home that have struck me a little bit, and sort of bringing in almost a medical opinion. That society owes you is one interesting part of that, and then longer lives and better lives as an overlying theme. You can look at the end of I'm going to say the end of life. I'm a doctor, we talk about end of life all the time. The latter stages of living, shall we say. because very few of us actually consider there are two things that unite all of us, which is being born and dying. And we don't have much of a conversation about death. We're not happy to talk about death, and we fail to recognize the last two years of our life are the most expensive for society. Society owes you to pay for those last 2 years of life. That's the health service. That's the premise that we sit in. If you look at the latter stages of life from two perspectives, those that are in it and those that are a long way from it. Those that retire earlier retiring, so one, because they think that they can afford to. I agree with the earlier points about we think but we don't know. But there's a second part, and we see it in the health service. The health service has got a great pension scheme, but my pension contributions are significantly more than those that are retired, and I know full well that I'm going to get an awful lot less out of it. So why should I be paying more taxes? Why should I be paying greater into the pension pot that's holding you together? What do I owe you other than the extra work that I'm providing? And young people are constantly thinking, what do I owe baby boomers? Don't they owe me a bit too? And then it comes back to society owes me. What is society? Society is ordered community. So actually, if we're talking about retirement, what we should really be talking about is an opportunity in life to give back to the community, to establish community, not talk about education at a really young age at primary school, because that's too late. That's far too late. Those children are sitting in the what do I owe baby boomers camp. But actually, what can I do in my retirement to inspire young people to do what I'm doing in retirement? Maybe that's a better narrative. Sorry, that was a bit of a monologue, but
no,
just a few of the points.
Yeah, lots of interesting points here. I mean, I think, there are some that argue that our, if you like, our sort of intergenerational social contract in our tax and pension system is under strain and is put under strain, not so much somewhat by longer lives, but also by just the sort of, as you say, if you like, the baby boomer generation, but the shifting population age structure, so that the ratio of people in their retirement to the ratio of the working population is changing and putting strain on who pays for who and when. Absolutely, I think that's really fundamental. The Treasury have for a long time debated this with a graph they like to call their scissors of doom graph, which is about this sort of changing tax take as the sort of aging, as the baby boomer bulge moves up through the population. So yeah, really interesting. I think sometimes the media, for what it's worth, I think sometimes the media over-egg actually the extent to which there is a genuine strain on that intergenerational social contract. It's a field of research I've done some work in, and I won't go into, but I think sometimes we read more stories about that than really actually reflect the reality of how we feel about where we should be spending our money as a society. But I think your point's also well made, Tim, about if you like, non sort of immediate GDP contributing roles in society. Part of the problem with our debate about who pays for what and what's affordable is this assumption that what matters is your sort of immediate direct contribution to the economy through working and producing value, goods and services, when actually, of course, our economy is hugely propped up and maintained by people who don't work. I'm only here tonight because my mum's downstairs looking after my young kids, for instance, and there are many other examples. What you say also, well, no, Sarah, there's so many interesting points. I'll stop there just in case somebody else wants to come in. I was going to sort of talk about end of life, but let me leave it there. Thanks though, Tim.
Thank you. Have we got any other questions from anyone? Or comments? Patrick.
Yeah, I think the concept of putting back or giving back is very important, but I think it can only be taught to a certain extent. I think it's as much caught as taught, and that means the role of parents is quite influential in that, in my view.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's actually something that's very rare. Just if you look at a specific measure like taking part in volunteering, becoming a volunteer, as one sort of measure of it, the data will show you it's actually very rare that people adopt volunteering behaviour, become a volunteer later in their life if they've never done it before. It's not something that sort of vast swathes of people suddenly start doing for the first time in retirement. If you volunteer in retirement, you're extremely likely to have been socially and civically active throughout your adult life. And so I'm sure these are values that are instilled in us early. I agree with you.
Thanks, Patrick. Mike, I think you put your hand up.
I was going to make a couple of comments. As someone who works in the voluntary sector, the idea of retirement isn't something I'm holding on to, because I imagine it might not be possible, or if it is possible, you know, I will still want to be busy, because I'm afraid I'm a type A personality who doesn't like the idea of not working. Anyway, I suppose the other thing I was going to come on to that with, because you were talking about being able to afford care with the aging population, and I think with care workers being under-resourced, I feel that there will be a bit of a crisis of being able to afford or have the manpower or woman power to do care for people at I think that's a crisis we're about to face. And I think Generation X are probably aware that by the time we get anywhere near retirement, the retirement age will be so high the boomers are taking the ladder up with them, and we will probably just get on with it and be, what's the word, resourceful and practical. But the millennials will probably complain about it, because millennials and boomers do seem to like to argue about that. Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, that was my thought.
Mike, I think that, you know, the state of our long-term care, social care system is, you know, one of the biggest policy failures of the last decades of this government. It's, you know, the National Health Service, the welfare state, was formed in the mid-20th century in an era where that sort of care was delivered unpaid in the home by women. Since then, though, women have gone to work and we haven't adapted. We haven't funded social care remotely adequately. We have these sort of institutional forms of dealing with it, the care home sector, some of which are good, some of which are bad, but most of which are horribly underfunded. And I think it's a huge issue. And of course, though, an issue that's very difficult to plan for as an individual, isn't it? As I'm sure you're more than aware, you know, you could maybe, you know, will you get cancer or will you get dementia? You don't know. If you get cancer, you'll be treated on the NHS. If you get dementia, you'll need to pay for it yourself, or at least the social care costs associated with it. So yeah, very, 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 very difficult. And I think, you know, one of the ways in which you could de-risk people's future would be, you know, an adequate response to publicly funding social care and risk pooling that risk through taxes and the way we do it for the NHS. That's my personal view. But it's a policy agenda that never rises up high enough amongst voters, never becomes enough of a priority amongst voters, that politicians tend to care about it, quite frankly. If you like, social care is to the NHS as adult education is to schools, and you know, 18 to 21 university. It's all schools and hospitals, when I think it should be adult education and social care just as much.
Brilliant, thank you. David, you put your hand up. I think you're on mute, David.
Sorry about that. I'm just wondering what the policy answer is to this, because listening to that last contribution, you would have thought that the number of votes in older people is going to increase. So therefore, there's an incentive for government to take their needs more seriously. All right, that's That's the first point. So how does one set about mobilizing that? Now, of course, that makes the assumption that the political environment that we've got doesn't change very much. Now, we have seen a change from party politics to issue-based politics. And I'm wondering if the answer to my own question is to make the aging and quality of life in older age issue one of these political issues around which a party might gather. Now,
Yes.
what the issues then might be, for instance, what the defence policy of that group might be and how that might differ from the others and why, becomes an interesting issue. But I just, my mind's just trying to work out how we take this forward to achieve some kind of change.
Yeah.
Sorry, Catherine.
No. I think it's fundamental. I think though that, as individual voters think as little about their long-term futures as politicians do. I mean, politicians, of course, famously operate on these very short-term cycles that enable policy for the long term to be extremely difficult, making, as Churchill said, democracy the worst form of government apart from all the others. Long-term policy setting is chronically difficult. So yes, answers on a postcard, please, Dave. Maybe you and me, David, maybe we should just start our own political party. Maybe that's the way to do it.
Love it. Tim, go on.
Just coming back from David and Mike's comments, and Catherine, yours too. David, I'm going to touch on your maybe the votes of older people need to take in, maybe the government would take note of older persons' needs. As somebody that works in the health service every day, and Mike, this comes back to yours. So the social care issues are well and truly at our door and have been for some time. Every day I go to theatre, want to start an operation, can't, because there's no bed. There's no bed because there's nowhere for patients to go to, and it's usually residential homes or nursing homes. Why is that? Lack of forward planning for individuals, not at a policy level. None of us believe that tomorrow is our last day. None of us will ever believe that tomorrow is our last day, and we all want independence. We want to be independent for as long as we can, and we'll fight tooth and nail for it. Even when our relatives are trying to put us in residential homes, we're not going to be wanting to do it. That's not policy. That's about us acknowledging the fact that we die, and in the last few years of our life, we're going to struggle, and we individually need to plan for that. And whether that's us individually for ourselves or for our family members, that's a central part of where we are. And that's not policy driven, that's community driven. That's society taking ownership for the problems that we have and not passing it on to somebody else and saying, oh, the government will fix it, because they won't. We're not going to ask for problems that we don't know are going to be there. And by the time they are there, we're incapacitated. We can't vote anyway.
So there you are, Sarah, you see, this agenda that I'm working on is fundamentally challenging to the inherent nature of the human experience, as well as the fundamental nature of democratic government, you name it. It's not easy, this stuff, is it? But I'm enjoying myself, and I've certainly enjoyed talking to you all.
Brilliant, thank you. I think, Catherine, you deserve a medal, and I'll hand over to Rob, I think.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for everyone's contribution. Interesting topic, something now that I've heard firsthand, and something I will actually start talking around, listening to the different views. I love the view of not end of life, but latter stages of living. I think it's a lovely phraseology that Tim put there. I think there is a societal, but also a community aspect. It is for us to pay forward, and should that be on the shoulders of policy and government, or should it be a partnership between the public and the private sector? And should businesses like Phoenix and others who are benefiting from people that do plan, should they be contributing to this aspect? And should we think around the lines of the E, S, and the G? We look a lot at climate change and the environment, But from the social aspect, very little is done there, and there's no regulation of what the top FTSE companies are doing and how they pay back or pay forward, back and forward, or just pay in general. And so I think it's a fantastic topic, and I think an hour doesn't really do us any service to look at this aspect of the social aspect and living longer, and how we can try and instill positive thinking and purpose away from just the office space, but also into being continual learners and developers across our life, and then giving back to society, to actually have it ingrained within ourselves and our families, to be thinking about how can I help others, and I'm making a contribution. 1 + 1 = 2, but if everyone is adding that one, then, and not everyone else is taking away, then society will be, and community will be preserved, and people can thrive in their last years of living, rather than being on the opposite. So I thank you, Catherine, for your insights. Sarah, always a pleasure. And for everyone this evening, thank you for joining us. We'll formally close the session now, but we will continue on. Catherine will stay with us for another 15 or 20 minutes, and the recording will end. So if there's any aspects you wanted to raise that you didn't want to be recorded, please feel free to ask those questions or make your observations and comments. Thank you, one and all. Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks so much. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.